I recently watched Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure for the first time, and I don't think I've ever seen a film quite like it. It's a film that leaves much up to interpretation and left me with so many questions that I wasn't even sure if I really liked the film or not. Typically, when I finish a film, I instantly pull up Letterboxd, write a dumbass review, and give it a rating. But occasionally, I'll watch one where I can't instantly write a review, and I need time to let it marinate. This happened with Celine Sciamma's Portrait of a Lady on Fire, and it just happened again with Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure. So I'm going to talk about what happens in the film and why I think it's so special. The film follows two people, a detective named Takabe and a mysterious amnesiac named Mamiya. Takabe is tasked with investigating a series of murders committed by people with no history of violence. They all appear to be seemingly normal people with normal lives and no motive at all. And Kurosawa does a great job depicting this in the second scene of the film. And the scene shows a man walking home from work with a plain expression on his face, no anger, no animosity, nothing. Just a normal guy walking home from work. And then the man proceeds to go home and murder a woman that's in his bed. And this all happens while Kurosawa plays a song titled Animal Magnetism, which sounds like a piece of score you would hear in a Wes Anderson film. It doesn't sound at all like music you would typically hear during a murder scene in a movie. And I think he made this choice to show us that it's not a normal murder, and that there's no hate or malice or emotion attached to this act. And this act's just committed in a very routine manner. It's so matter-of-fact, just like you would brush your teeth or take out the trash. This choice elevates the audience's sense of uneasiness and makes the scene feel so unnatural due to the contrast between the dark and sadistic act on screen and the light and joyous music accompanying it. And as you see in the next scene, when Takabe shows up to investigate the crime scene, it wasn't committed by a man with any sense of reason. He left his clothes there, he left his ID there, he left the murder weapon in the sink, and he also left the shower curtain on the outside of the tub when he cleaned off the blood, so all of the blood shower water just leaked out onto the floor. He had no concern about being caught at all, and it's almost like he wasn't really in control of his body. In the next scene, Takabe and his partner argue about murders, where his partner believes that most murders don't have any meaning and that they just happen. And Takabe disagrees and doesn't think murders like this could just happen. Then we see a mysterious young man who we later find out is named Mamiya. And he's wandering around a beach, he walks up to this other man and starts asking him questions, and then Mamiya tells him he doesn't know who he is and that he's going nowhere. He asks the man for help, so the man brings him into his home, and then Mamiya deflects all of his questions and says, "I don't remember anything, but you do." So Mamiya keeps asking questions about this guy and his life, until Mamiya eventually pulls out a cigarette and a lighter. And the man appears to get caught in a trance looking at the lighter, which is one of the coolest shots in the film, by the way, and it looks at first like it's a split diopter shot, but I don't actually think it is, because I don't think split diopter was necessary since the lighter flame doesn't have to be in focus. It's only the man in the background that does. But anyway, after the cigarette's lit, the last we see of this scene is Mamiya saying, "Tell me more about your wife." The next time we see this man, he's jumping out of his bedroom window after killing his wife, who he said he had no issues with. Takabe goes to visit him, and the man is aware of what he did, but he doesn't know why he did it. He says at the time, it just felt like the natural thing to do. Similar to the first guy we saw at the beginning of the film. After that, we see Takabe walk down the exact same underpass that the man at the beginning of the film walked down. Takabe stands there while the flickering light shines onto his face. And I think this is foreshadowing for Takabe's fate and his internal struggle between light and dark, or good and evil. And now we catch up with Mamiya as he's posted up on top of a building. A police officer sees him and takes him in for questioning, but as we all know, Mamiya isn't too fond of answering questions. So he pulls out his lighter and asks the police officer about himself. The scene ends there. Next, we see Takabe introduce the idea of hypnotism to his partner. And basically, his partner says hypnotism's a common practice, but hypnotic suggestion can't change someone's nature. If someone thinks murder's evil, hypnotic suggestion can't convince them to murder someone. But you could convince someone to cut an X pattern, though it would take forever to get a suggestion like that into place, and the hypnotist would have to be a genius. Then we return to the police station, and we see the police officer murder his partner, same as the man at the beginning of the film. Like nothing's wrong, like he's brushing his teeth. Next, we see Mamiya visit a doctor, and this is the first time that we see him hypnotize a victim without the use of his lighter. This time he uses a glass of water. Somehow the process of the water filling up and then spilling onto the ground puts the doctor into a trance. And Mamiya says, "All the things that used to be inside me is all outside now. That's why I can see all the things inside you." After this, we see Mamiya get inside of her head. He asks her why she became a doctor, and she couldn't say. But then he says, "Now you remember. When you were in medical school, you dissected a corpse, and it made you feel good, didn't it?" And then he draws an X on the wall and leaves. And now we know for sure that Mamiya is fully capable of reading people's minds and getting inside of their head. Next, we see Takabe question the police officer that killed his partner, and Takabe starts leaning into his hypnosis theory, so he shines a red light in the officer's face, and he reacts sort of odd to it. And then he walks over and grabs what looks like chopsticks and starts doing an X pattern over one of the cop's throat and chest. Takabe asks him what the motion was that he just did with his hands, and he doesn't know. He doesn't know at all what made him do it or what it means. Then we cut back to the doctor that Mamiya visited, and she's cutting a man's face off, with of course the X pattern carved into his throat. We then see the toilet overflowing, which must have caused her to commit the murder. Since she was hypnotized with water, it makes sense that her seeing a flushing toilet would send her back into a trance. After that, we see Takabe on his way to the crime scene where the doctor peeled the guy's face off. But as he's driving there, he gets a call about a suspicious person at the hospital and that he was taken there by Mr. Aido, the police officer that killed his partner. So Takabe instantly changes directions and heads there. He finds Mamiya and brings him into his interrogation room. Takabe tries to ask him questions, but he doesn't answer, and he starts to get really frustrated with him not answering any of his questions. So he takes all of his shit, and he finds his apartment, and his apartment has about 50 books centered around hypnotism and mesmer. And he learns that he was a psychology student. Then we get this very interesting editing where there's these quick flashes of earlier scenes from the film that appear to represent what Takabe is experiencing in his head, and this is possibly what Mamiya's victims see when they're under his trance. Takabe then goes home, where he walks into the kitchen and sees that his wife has killed herself. And we get one of the best displays of acting that I've ever seen in my life. Then, as Takabe is on his knees crying, his wife suddenly appears right in front of him, alive and well. So obviously Mamiya is infecting Takabe's mind and making him see things that aren't there. Takabe then instantly goes to visit Mamiya, and Mamiya says, "You saw your dead wife, didn't you?" Takabe has a breakdown and finally gives in and tells Mamiya about his life and his sick wife, and Mamiya tells him that he's amazing, and that'll make him happy, empty, and that he'll be born again, just like him. This is the first time that Mamiya makes his intentions with Takabe clear to the audience. He wants Takabe to gain his quote-unquote powers from his perspective. Mamiya's emptiness and lack of self is what makes him so carefree and able to enjoy his life. Unlike Takabe, who's so concerned about his job and his wife that it's beginning to tear him apart. It's safe to assume that there have been people in the past that use these same hypnosis methods that Mamiya is using, but what makes him so powerful and successful at it is him being an amnesiac. He doesn't have the conscience that other people have. He doesn't have that side of his brain that fights back and tells him not to do something bad. Instead of Mamiya's evil spirit controlling half of him like most people, it controls all of him. Takabe and his partner then start discussing what they found in Mamiya's apartment. And what they found in his apartment were books on Mesmer, who is an 18th century doctor who was the first recorded person to study hypnotism. Then his partner says, "Don't talk to him. You don't know what could happen." And I think that's such a great line to depict what's so terrifying about this film. This isn't a normal serial killer that you can just go interrogate. They can take away people's weapons in an interrogation room, but they can't take away anyone's mind. Anytime Takabe speaks to Mamiya, he's risking his mind state and sanity. Takabe comes home from work to find a raw piece of meat sitting on the table, which is showing his wife's condition is worsening, and it leads him to drop her off at this asylum/hospital until his work settles down. So it's obviously been too much for him to handle between his work, his depleting mental state due to Mamiya's hypnosis, and his wife's bad health. Then he goes to the dry cleaners that he's been to a couple times in the film, but this time the employee says that his clothes aren't there, which I think is telling us that Mamiya's hypnosis is leading to Takabe thinking he's done things that he hasn't, and he's slowly not being able to tell what's real and what isn't. Takabe then goes to a diner where he barely touches his food, which I do think is significant, and I'll bring it up in a second. Takabe then meets his partner, who found the oldest material on hypnotism, which is a video of a lady who was arrested for the murder of her son, which she killed by cutting an X shape into his throat, the same way Mamiya does. In the next scene, we see Takabe's partner have a dream sequence where he wanders into Mamiya's cell, and he sees the bathtub that Mamiya had in his apartment, and Takabe is there standing behind him, watching him. Then he breaks out of his dream and goes to his room where we see a huge X on his wall, and this is showing that Mamiya has gotten to him as well. Then we see Mamiya in his cell, and he appears to be making everything around him shake, like there's an earthquake. And I could be wrong, but this was just my interpretation. The shaking could have been coming from something else. But I think this is showing one of Mamiya's abilities, which is also something that Takabe's wife was doing in the first scene of the film when she was shaking the table. And that feeds into a popular theory that she isn't sick and that she wasn't diagnosed with some illness, but rather that she had an experience with Mamiya that led her to her current state of brain function. Then Mamiya is able to break out of his prison cell and kill the guard by what I assume is the repeating sound of the banging of the chair on the pipes, something that he attempted to do earlier in the film when Takabe was interrogating him and he was rhythmically tapping on the wall. In the next scene, we find out that Takabe's partner has killed himself, and honestly, Takabe looks like he couldn't give less of a fuck. It doesn't seem to bother him at all. It seems like he's now completely lost himself and isn't capable of feeling anything. He then goes to this big abandoned building where Mamiya walks in and asks, "Why did you let me escape?" Which means Takabe supposedly had some part in Mamiya's escape. Takabe then shoots Mamiya and asks him if he remembers now. Mamiya nods yes and makes an X shape with his fingers over Takabe's throat, and then Takabe shoots him in the head. He then finds an old phonograph that plays this cryptic message. Then it instantly cuts to Takabe's wife being pushed down a hallway in a hospital with her throat slit, which was obviously done by Takabe. And the film ends with Takabe going back to the same diner he was at earlier, but now his plate is clean. A loss of appetite is a common issue for people who are struggling with something, and I think Takabe not being able to finish his food was an indicator of his internal struggle between good and evil. He's been fully consumed by Mamiya's hypnosis and no longer fights with himself internally. He's at peace, and he feels whole, just like Mamiya said would happen earlier in the film, so now he's able to finish his food. And as Takabe sits at his table about to leave, we see him light up a cigarette, as Mamiya used to do. And then his waitress grabs a knife and starts walking over to her boss. And the film ends right there. We can assume that right after the camera cuts, she did kill her boss. And this tells us that not only did Takabe kill Mamiya and his wife, but that he's going to keep Mamiya's cycle of random and senseless murders going. And I think what's so genius about Cure is the way that Kurosawa made it. He gave the film itself a hypnotic element. I think he creates this hypnotic feeling in many different ways, but one of my favorites was his use of score, or lack thereof. We see the score in the second scene of the film, which I talked about earlier, but other than that, there's pretty much no music at all. Instead of using music, he amplifies these sounds in the background. Like when Takabe's at home and there's a dryer running, he amplifies the sound of the dryer, and it's very repetitious, and it feels very hypnotizing. He also does this thing where he'll use the same shot over and over again at different times in the story, and it sort of makes you feel like you're on a loop. He also uses great editing choices. He'll cut scenes short right before the most interesting part of the scene happens, so each scene doesn't really leave you fulfilled, it leaves you wanting more. And I think his editing to show Takabe's mind state in the scene in the car was also another brilliant choice that gives it a hypnotizing effect. And throughout the film, he also uses extremely long takes, which I think also adds to the film's hypnotizing nature. And while I was researching the film, I found out that it was originally titled Evangelist. And Kurosawa actually changed the title while in production due to the Tokyo subway sarin attacks, because he didn't want to suggest a connection between the real-life religious cult and the crimes in the film. And I think that the original title, being Evangelist, adds to the idea that the film is about the dangers of religion. In an interview, Kurosawa said that he isn't an atheist, but he's also not fully religious either. And while it's a little hard to grasp exactly what he's commenting about on religion specifically with Cure, it could be interpreted that he believes that religion is a positive for the person believing in it, while it's harmful to everyone else around the person. In the film, Mamiya is doing horrible things to the people around him, but he himself feels completely at peace and happy. Whatever he is saying with Cure, it definitely doesn't feel like the perspective of a religious filmmaker. And though this isn't the first serial killer film I've seen where the bad guy wins, it is the first one I've seen where the protagonist turns into the antagonist by the end of the film. And it doesn't end with any sense of closure. Spoilers for the movie 7 if you haven't seen it. At the end of 7, John Doe's dead. Awful things happen to many people in the film, but by the end of it, there's no longer any threat. Other than Brad Pitt's character going to jail for murder, everything else should go back to normal. But that's not the case with Cure. It ends in a very nihilistic manner, with Takabe becoming the new Mamiya. The cycle repeats. Not only was the issue not solved, but it got worse. There's more of a threat now due to Takabe's position of power. And that ending leaves you thinking about what happens after the closing shot. But those are just my thoughts on the film. If you have any theories, leave them in the comments. I'm almost at 200 followers on Letterboxd, so I'd love for you to follow me there so I can see what you guys are watching. And if you're new to the channel, please subscribe. And also check out my other channel for my podcast, The Film Scoop. We upload every week. And yeah, thank you for watching.